Dawn broke over Gideon Harlow's fallen saddle, and I found a cub trembling beside it. The saddle lay broken in frost, but what shook beside it was still alive. The leather hit the snow with a sound I felt in my teeth, an animal thud, one stirrup still kicking as if the fall hadn't finished arguing with gravity. Frost smoked off the flank of the wrecked saddle. My boot slid. The cinch strap was sliced clean, edges stiff with cold. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods a crow took attendance, and the wind told me its version of the story. Hoofbeats, a wrong turn, a short prayer, a hard landing. Then I heard the breathing. Not a horse, a smaller furnace, thin and percussive, like a fire trying to stay legal in a town that hates sparks. I crouched, and the snow squeaked the way snow does when the cold is honest. Under the shadow of the saddle, a bear cub pressed itself into leather like a child into a locked door. He was no bigger than a feed sack. Ice clung to the tips of his fur where the wind had combed him cruel. One ear stood, the other was notched, torn into a crooked V that made his face look older and his body look smaller. He trembled so hard the frost shook off in glitter. "Easy," I told him, and lied again. "You're okay." He didn't look at me. He looked at the saddle as if it knew what to do next. Dawn was still choosing colors. Blue pulled on gray, gray buttoned white. The pasture glittered like it had secrets and was bad at keeping them. Around us, the ground held the scene in a bowl of signs. Hoofprints flared wide, rider thrown or bailed, a stagger of bootprints cutting away toward the river trees, a dotted punctuation of rust-dark drops where the cold had failed to level everything into silence. I should have followed the blood. That's the respectable move. Look for the living person before you babysit ruin. But the cub's breath kept asking a question I recognized from other lives, the one you can't translate unless you've stood in a doorway and decided to be smaller than your need. "Where's your mother?" I asked, because I needed to hear a voice, and mine was the only one that still believed me. His ear twitched. He didn't run. He didn't show teeth. He chose a different defense. He became less. I slid my hands slow as good weather and stopped an inch from that torn ear. He flinched hard enough to make the saddle creak, then held still like stillness was a spell he knew by heart. Somewhere under my coat the old ache woke, the kind you inherit when the first lesson the world teaches is that belonging is expensive and distance is on sale. I had learned that in rooms that smelled like disinfectant and paperwork, under buzzing diner lights where the waitress knows your order and not your last name, on cracked sidewalks where your face reflects in puddles and the reflection looks like a witness you can't pay. "Okay," I said. "Not yet." The wind rotated and I smelled cedar. That shouldn't happen here, not clean like that. Not like a house with a vocabulary for warmth. I stood to thaw my knees and saw the boot prints biting deep with one heel. Whoever walked out of this mess had a limp or a conscience or both. The prints sloped toward the cottonwoods. The cedar lived that way too. The truth is ugly. I wasn't afraid of teeth. I was afraid of responsibility. It isn't the bite that scars, it's what you owe afterward. I shrugged out of my coat and laid it like a sky over the cub, not trapping, covering. He shuddered once, then twice, then learned how to be still in a new language. When I slid my hands under him, heat surprised me. Life stores fire in places you don't expect. He weighed less than my history and somehow more. My arms remembered how to carry before my mind decided if I should. Smart, I told nobody. Smart is staying alive long enough to decide what to forgive. He smelled like wet hide and a mineral idea of snow. Up close I saw the ash smudge mark between his eyes, like somebody had pressed a thumb there and blessed him or claimed him. Either way it registered. His heartbeat was a ridiculous drum. Mine tried to bully it into a calmer time. We found a compromise that made the morning less dangerous. Boot prints, smoke, a wrecked saddle, a trembling question alive in my coat. I chose a direction and pretended it was bravery. The cottonwoods kept the sky for themselves. Ice braided the creek into quiet syllables. On a low branch, a strip of red flannel hung stiff as bad manners. I pinched it free. It cracked in my finger. Fresh, but not the kind of fresh that bleeds in your hands. A day, too. The creek coughed under ice like an old man clearing a lie. I set the cub down within reach of my boots to test the next minutes. He didn't run. He climbed onto my foot with both paws, claws clicking my leather in question marks. Weight, warm and definite, settled on my laces. He leaned into me like gravity had a favorite. "Stay," I told him, and didn't say it like a command. Wishes deserve better. The smoke sat low and small beyond a veil of willow. Somebody had built that fire like a person who respects fuel and wind and consequences. The trail slid into brush, then lost its nerve. Cedar breathed out once, steady as a promise you make only after you've kept it for a year. I pushed into the willow and found a clearing the size of a held breath. Snow there wasn't virginal, it was understood. A ring where knees had been, a nest smoothed by a careful coat, a narrow trench shaved into damp wood, where someone had coaxed small curls with a blade until ignition learned its job. At the center, ash tidy as a signature. Nearby, a short length of cord coiled in the shape that competent hands leave when they don't want to argue with knots later. I wasn't the first person who had been tender here. The cub nosed the ash and sneezed into history. He sniffed the cord and made a sound I can't name, part question, part apology. The notched ear angled toward me as if to say, "You are late, but you came." I let my hand hover above his head until the hovering turned into permission. When I touched him, he flinched and stayed. That counts. The air lifted like a curtain. Cedar deepened to something lived in. A presence, not the loud kind, assembled itself at the edge of the clearing, as if the willows were introducing us and wanted us to behave. I didn't turn yet. I listened. The rider, the blood, the cut cinch, the cub, the careful fire. Every piece made a picture that wasn't finished, and I've learned not to color in missing sections with fear. I put the cub back in my coat, rehearsed a steady breath, and let my boots make a sound that could be mistaken for confidence. We walked out of the willows and back into pasture light. The saddle waited where ruin waits, patient, with receipts. I scanned the horizon out of habit and self-preservation. Far across the flats, a pale haze of snow ghosts lifted like a theater troupe learning its marks. The crow relocated to a fence post and auditioned laughter. A crack cut the morning. Not thunder, not trees. A rifle, far enough that air ate most of it. The cub startled, digging little crescents into my wrist. I tightened my hold and felt that ridiculous heart hustle against my palm. "You're safe," I said, leaving room in the sentence for truth to catch up. For now, cold conducted its argument through the soles of my boots. The math of it was simple. Time, wind, skin, breath. Lay down, go quiet, join the ash. The offer was not without kindness. If I rested here, the world would stop asking me to answer questions I had avoided since I learned my first address could change without my permission. I looked at the saddle again and saw what I didn't want to see. A tuft of hair in the buckle, dark and not hoarse. The cut on the cinch wasn't clean. The leather had frayed the way it does when a blade is wielded by a shaking hand or a moving one. Nearby, the snow had melted into a shallow dish and refrozen, its ice bruised by something warm that didn't stay. "Where did you go?" I asked, meaning the rider, the one who had either stood and limped toward the creek or had been lifted by someone who knew which edges to hold. "And who are you to leave fires that know how to behave?" The wind stole my questions and delivered an answer made of scent. Cedar, yes, but under it a note like dried sage and horse and clean hide. Practical smells, the kind that belong to people who understand that healing is a verb, not a profession. I wasn't alone. Every muscle remembered its training. Step back, lower eyes, let distance do its trick. But the weight in my arms canceled old orders. The cub had picked me no romance in the choice, just biology and triage, and that meant my body had to learn new choreography. Leave later. Stand now. "I'm not taking him," I said to the air, because the air had already decided there was a conversation happening. "I'm carrying him away from where he breaks." Snow whispered the shape of a figure into being. At first it was only a taller quiet. Then the quiet built details, the way a painter builds from shadow, bare branches scribed against a shawl, a line of braid dark as riverbed, the precise economy of shoulders that don't waste motion. The person ruled out panic by existing. She didn't announce herself. She didn't perform concern. She let the land introduce her. And it did. My mouth filled with a taste like coins, the taste of old fear pretending to be wisdom. I have run from 1,000 rooms where kindness waited. I have better excuses than most men, and worse. But the cub moved, and the movement answered for me. He lifted his head and pressed the notch of his ear against my jaw. It was not affection, it was geography. He redrew my map with his fear. "Hello," the shape said. The voice was low, precise, like a note tested on the tongue before, being given to air. No rush, no apology. "You found what you were supposed to find." "I didn't know I was looking," I said, and heard in my own words the lie I'd been rehearsing since I learned that doors could shut and stay shut, and that the smaller you make yourself, the less the door seems to mind. She stepped one pace closer. The cedar smell folded around us like a blanket with a memory. Her face came into the honesty of light, steady eyes, the kind of calm that doesn't need anyone to clap for it. She took in my arms, the coat, the cub's ear, the wrecked saddle. She read the land the way the land likes to be read, not as scenery, but as testimony. "You cut the cinch?" I asked before I could stop the accusation from hitching a ride on my breath. "No," she said, "but I know the hand that did." She looked past me at the cottonwoods, at the creek, at the clearing I had walked into like a man who thinks discovery is an invention. "And I know the price." The cold tried again. It promised quiet if I would put down every noun I was carrying. "Cub?" Question. My name. The promise smelled like snow pillows and the kind of sleep that forgives you for being tired. I bent under the weight of the offer, and the cub responded by trembling worse, the way small bodies do when the big one holding them chooses indecision. That decided it. "My name is Silas," I said, "because names are either leashes or lifelines depending on how you hold them." I shifted the cub so he could see my face and then hers. "Are you here for him?" "I'm here for what's still breathing," she said. She left a space after the sentence where other people would have packed a bargain. "And for what keeps it breathing after I leave." The snow quit sounding like it wanted us gone. The crow downshifted into the scolding it uses when it approves of your choices but refuses to say so. I wanted to ask everything. "Who are you? Where is the rider? Why does the cub smell like a house I don't remember? What do you mean you know the hand? How much will it cost me to carry this one small life into noon?" I closed my mouth on all of it. I have ruined more than one mercy by cross-examining it. The cub turned, finally, and looked at me, not at my coat, not at my throat for a pulse, at me. His eyes were glassed with cold and young fear, and that stubborn thing that keeps animals alive, even when men vote otherwise. He didn't ask out loud. He didn't have to. Every tremor in his body wrote the sentence on the inside of my ribs. "Will you stay?" The wind held its breath to hear my answer. Cedar made the day smell like a room with a door that opens inward. Somewhere far off, a rifle or a memory finished falling apart. I shifted my weight toward the cottonwoods, where the cold would try to convince me that lying down is a kind of wisdom. I shifted it back toward the figure whose voice didn't argue. It witnessed. Between those two gravities, a soft grave and an offered room, the cub's heartbeat tapped once against my palm like a knuckle on wood. I tightened my arms. The question didn't end. It widened. And in that stretch of silence, where choices learn their real names, I turned with the cub toward the trees and the cedar, and the person who hadn't asked me for anything yet, and felt the cold lay out its last, sweetest invitation behind us like a bed I was done dying in. The cold will offer sleep again before noon. The rifle won't be the last sound that pretends to be weather, and the person who smells like cedar will ask for something I have never given without running first. The snow whispered, "Lie down." The cub whispered louder, "Stay." The cold knows how to lie. It doesn't scream. It doesn't claw. It whispered. The snow around me whispered one sentence over and over again. "Lie down." Rest. It's easier this way. The voice was soft, kind, the way silence turns into a blanket and convinces you that surrender is another kind of warmth. I might have listened. I had listened before, in different winters on cracked sidewalks, under the buzzing bulbs of 24-hour diners, inside foster halls that reeked of bleach and abandonment. The cold had always been patient with me, always willing to wait until I got tired of pretending to be strong. But tonight, the cub ruined the silence. He trembled inside my coat, claws gripping the fabric near my ribs, small body shaking with a rhythm too fragile to ignore. His breath steamed against my chest, fast and desperate. He wasn't whispering in words, but the plea was clear. Stay, stay awake. Don't let me be alone. And that whisper was louder than the snow. The wind pulled harder, sliding its fingers down my spine. Frost climbed my boots, tried to gnaw through the leather. I shifted my weight and kept moving toward the cottonwoods. The cub's warmth pressed against me like a second heart. Every step was a negotiation. My legs wanted to stop, to fold. My lungs begged me to breathe slower, to conserve heat. My mind whispered the easy solution. Leave the cub, carry only yourself. That's what survival means. But survival had never been enough. I knew that too well. The hoofprints widened, the ground telling its story in shallow bowls. The rider's trail staggered, boots dragging. A smear of rust-dark blood interrupted the white, just enough to remind me that violence had already visited this place. Whoever they were, they had gone down hard and hadn't walked out whole. The cub stirred, let out a soft whimper muffled by my coat. His torn ear brushed my hand, and something inside me cracked. Not like ice, like memory. I remembered the nights when I had no one to hold on to but myself. In foster homes, I'd learned quickly not to cry loud. Crying loud made you a target. Crying quiet just made you invisible. Either way, the doors closed and the lights shut off, and you were left to guard your breath like it was contraband. I remembered sitting in a booth at a diner at 3 a.m., coffee cooling untouched, watching strangers who had names and laughter while I had only silence. I remembered letters addressed to me that I never opened, because truth written in ink is harder to face than silence. I remembered mirrors in penthouse bathrooms that reflected me back like a ghost, a man who existed only in outline, never in belonging. And here was this cub, pressed against me, whispering the same prayer I used to whisper at 13 years old in a bed that didn't know my name. Stay, just stay. I tightened my grip around him. I'm here, I muttered, though my lips were numb. For now, I'm here. The snow hissed under my boots. Ahead, the cottonwoods leaned together, branches sketching dark ribs across the pale sky. The crow I'd heard earlier flapped away, black against white, as if it didn't want to witness what was waiting for me. The boot prints cut toward the trees, dragging heavier now. Blood droplets grew more frequent. Whoever had walked this way wasn't going to last long. The cub whimpered again, his small body pressed tighter against me. I bent, burying my face in the coarse fur of his head, inhaling his wild smell. Earth, milk, smoke. He smelled alive, and alive was more valuable than anything else in this frozen graveyard of tracks and broken saddles. Don't make me choose, I whispered. But the truth was, the choice had already been made. A sharp wind cut through the clearing, lifting loose powder in a small spiral. It made the trees groan, their branches snapping like brittle bone. The cold whispered again, lie down, rest. He won't last. You won't last. Why carry two bodies into death when one would do? I shook my head hard, as if I could dislodge the voice. The cub stirred, tiny claws scraping against my chest. He was awake, even in his weakness, as if to remind me, don't listen, don't give in. The snow shifted behind me. For a heartbeat, I thought it was just the wind, but no, this sound was different, heavier, deliberate. I froze, listening. Hoofbeats, number, not close enough. This was weight on boots, measured, steady. Someone was following or circling. The cub pressed his head under my chin, his whole body stiffened, listening too. Animals don't mistake sound the way men do. He knew it wasn't wind. I adjusted my grip, pulled the coat tighter around him, and pressed forward toward the trees. At the edge of the cottonwoods, I paused. The prints and blood trailed deeper into shadow, vanishing where the snow grew rough with roots. I shifted the cub in my arms and looked back. The pasture behind me stretched empty, white and merciless. The fallen saddle glistened with frost, and just at the edge of the wind, I thought I heard it again, something heavy shifting where no horse stood. "Not now," I muttered. "Not yet." The cub whimpered again, louder this time, burying his head hard into my chest. His small body shook, not with cold but with fear, and then the sound broke through the silence. A rifle crack. The shot echoed across the pasture, bouncing off the trees, sharp and sudden enough to slice the morning in half. My body locked. The cub cried out once and pressed his face hard against me, claws digging in as though I was the last tree left standing in a burning forest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I only listened to the ringing silence that followed. One truth settled heavy in my bones. That shot wasn't an accident. Someone out there was close enough to watch, and someone out there didn't want us alive. The cub's trembling against my chest felt like a heartbeat, not my own. I turned toward the cedar smoke I'd smelled earlier, because if I didn't find whoever was burning it, I knew the next bullet would. Ivy Redfern appeared like winter that worked for her, not against her. The echo of the rifle still sat in my ears when she appeared. At first, I thought it was the snow playing another trick. The cold makes ghosts out of shadows, but no, she was too steady to be a trick, too rooted, the kind of presence that doesn't ask permission from weather. She didn't arrive with noise. She didn't announce herself. She materialized like winter does when you finally stop running and let it catch you. Her shawl was drawn across her shoulders, edges stiff with frost, but the way she wore it made the fabric look less like cloth and more like armor. Her hair was braided long, strands threaded with beads that clinked softly, like punctuation in a sentence too old for me to read. Her eyes dark, steady, took me in the way the land does, measuring without judgment, recognizing without permission. The cub stirred in my arms, but he didn't cry. He stilled, watching her. Animals know when the air shifts from danger to something else. She stepped closer, slow but certain, boots cutting clean prints in the snow. She knelt, her shawl brushing the frost, and held her hand out toward the cub without fear. No rush, no demand, just presence. "Asher," I whispered, surprising myself with the name. Ash had marked his brow. Now it had a voice. She glanced up at me briefly when she heard it, then back at the cub. Her hand hovered inches away until the cub leaned forward, sniffed, and pressed his torn ear against her finger. She didn't flinch at the scar. She stroked gently, her voice low and sure. Some things tremble before they belong. The words rooted deeper than the cold could reach. I wanted to believe her, but belief had always cost me more than hunger. I shifted my stance, keeping one arm tight around Asher. "Who are you?" My voice came out harder than I meant. She didn't answer directly. She never even looked away from the cub. "The land brings what it keeps alive," she said. "I don't question it. I only work for it." Her calm unsettled me more than the rifle shot had. I'd met men with guns and men with greed. I knew how to measure both. But her? She was unreadable. She carried herself like someone who had survived too much to waste words. The wind twisted through the cottonwoods again. Beneath the cedar smoke I caught the faintest trace of another smell: oil, metal, a rifle's aftertaste. "You heard it too," I said. She nodded once, still stroking Asher's fur. "Poachers," she murmured, baiting the line, cutting straps, wounding what they can't own so they can claim it later. Men who don't hunt for food, only for possession. The cub whimpered at her words, burying himself against her hand. She let him. I stared at her, my chest tight. "And what do you want from me?" Finally, she looked at me. Her eyes didn't blink. They didn't soften. They weighed. "I want nothing," she said. "But he needs you to choose. Either you carry him into silence, or you let him belong to something that will keep him alive." Her certainty frightened me more than any gun, because deep inside, I already knew I'd never been good at carrying silence. The cub pressed tighter into her touch. My hands shook around him. I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe. that cedar smoke meant safety. But trust is a fire I'd been burned by too many times. I shifted back half a step, the snow crunching under my boots. Her gaze followed me, steady, unflinching, like she had seen this dance 100 times before, men fighting ghosts no one else could see. And then the sound carried again, laughter, men's voices, coarse and too close, carried by the wind. The cub froze, Ivy's hand stilled on his fur. My pulse slammed against my ribs. The laughter wasn't joy, it was ownership, the sound of men who thought the world was already theirs. They're closer than they should be, Ivy said softly, and they won't stop until something pays. The cub whimpered, pressing between us. Ivy stood, her shawl snapping in the wind, and for the first time I realized if I stayed with her, I might have to fight more than the cold. I might have to fight myself. The men's laughter blew across the pasture like a bad weather report, thin at first and then too certain to ignore. Ivy didn't look back at it. She turned into the cottonwoods and moved in that practiced way you only learn after surviving several winters, one foot placed where the ground has already agreed, shoulders quiet, breath kept like a secret. I followed, my arms full of a life that trembled and trusted me anyway. The cub Asher, though I hadn't earned the right to name him yet, was small heat against my ribs, his torn ear rasping the inside of my coat whenever the wind tried to talk me into surrender. He weighed less than a saddlebag, less than a bucket of creek water, less than the guilt I've dragged from address to address for years, and still my arms shook with him, not from mass, but from vow. Some weights are arithmetic, easy to reckon between shoulder and elbow. This one was moral, and it traveled differently, down the spine, into the breath, through the part of the chest that learns to brace when no one shows up. We crossed the first string of water, where the creek wore its ice like a loose shirt, the current clicking its teeth underneath. Ivy tested each stone with the toe of her boot. I matched her cadence and kept Asher high, feeling the cold reach up for our ankles with the greedy politeness winter uses when it wants to convince you that lying down is reasonable. The cottonwoods gathered us into a ribcage of gray branches. Wind slashed through the seams, cutting the snow into long sentences that read, "Not welcome, not wise, not for the likes of you." Behind us, laughter faded to engine cough and then to the indifferent exhale of open land. Ahead, the cedar smoke I'd smelled earlier drew a thin line in the air, the sort of honest smell you can follow without bargaining with yourself. "What do I call him?" I asked before I could stop the question from happening out loud. I meant it the way a boy means it, requesting permission from an adult who can say yes without ruining him. Ivy's braids swung once, and in the swing I read more knowledge than I liked: how to set a broken wing, how to teach breath back into a panicked body, how to stay long enough for someone to learn that staying is a skill, not a miracle. "You already did," she said without turning. Her voice didn't carry authority so much as gravity. "Asher, it was just the ash," I said, thinking of the thumbprint-looking smudge between his eyes, of the depot ruins that had rebranded the world black. "It seemed to fit. Names fit when the body recognizes them," she said. "That's all." We cut across a meadow where the wind had braided snow into low drifts. I tucked Asher tighter under the coat and tried to use my ribs as a wall. He burrowed, found the memory of my heartbeat under the layers, and matched it like a stubborn student. The ground pitched and shouldered us toward a low bench. There, half swallowed by willows and sensible about its size, a cabin revealed itself the way shy animals do, with one detail at a time. First the smoke, a ribbon strung at human height, then the roofline, not proud but practical, its pitch set by someone who had listened to weather's temper long enough to compromise. A fence of creek-worn posts gathered a yard that was really a workspace, a sawhorse scarred by use, a sled lashed and ready, stacks of split cedar that had been cut in different moods, some impatient, some careful. The door was the color cedar becomes when you keep your promises. Ivy palmed the latch like it was an old friend. Hinges didn't whine. Inside, the heat was a slow animal, not theatrical but present, Cedar smoke laid its palm on my chest and pushed the cold out in increments my body could forgive. Herbs hung from a beam like a soft catalog, yarrow bundles, sage, strips of willow bark curled into commas. On a peg, a coil of cord worn smooth by decision. On a nail, a tin cup patched so precisely the scar had become decoration. Furs were thrown where floors discover their mercy. The room smelled like work that never bragged. "Put him there," she said, nodding to a low crate lined with an old wool shirt and cedar shaving. She didn't say crib or pen or box. She said it like a verb, there, meaning a place made gently on purpose. I knelt and eased Asher into the shirt. He made the smallest complaint, then let the warmth of the wool persuade him into being less afraid. Ivy crouched beside him and ran 2 fingers along his side, stopping to feel the flutter of ribs, the stubborn drama of breath. She didn't make soothing noises. She didn't perform calm. She simply offered it. "Hungry," she said, reading him as if hunger has the same face in every species. "Cold second, fear first." "I know those in the other order," I said, before the part of me that prefers silence could save me from it. She glanced at me the way weather glances at a man who thinks he invented clouds. "You'll reorder them by staying," she said, then rose and moved through. The room, like heat, follows intention. She set a small pot on the stove where the fire had been banked down into coals that glowed like intentional embers. No show, just competence. Steam began its patient argument with the air. She dropped herbs into a second cup, poured water, and let a small green smell push the last of outdoors out of my throat. On a shelf, a row of bottles wore handwritten labels with dates. The oldest ones were oftenest used. The newest waited their turn like recruits. I stood there, suddenly huge and useless, my hands remembering how to clench when they aren't permitted to help. The last room that had let me stand in it like this had been an office where second chances live on clipboards, and I learned how to pretend I didn't hear my name called. Doors close softly when you don't stand, and I'd taught myself to mistake that softness for grace. Here, the door had closed behind us, with a sound that meant, for now, we keep the wind out. "Here," Ivy said, offering a wooden bowl that had been hand-sanded to the kind of smooth that teaches palms a better attitude. "Sit," she said it like an engineer instructing a beam. "Eat." I Saturday. She gave me a stew so modest it made every expensive meal I've ever eaten look like a lie. Meat pulled into strands, potato taking its job seriously, a hint of smoke that might have been nostalgia if nostalgia had calorie value. Asher, as if offended by anyone else eating first, peeped a complaint and tried to stand. Ivy had a rubber-topped bottle before he found his feet, the kind you warm between your hands so trust isn't asked to work alone. When she slipped it into his mouth, he hesitated and then remembered how to be a creature that accepts what is offered. He drank, like the world was briefly good. "He'll keep the name," she said, as if continuing a conversation we'd left in the trees. "Asher. The ash isn't just what's left after fire. It's what carries heat when flame is gone. I'll try to carry the rest," I said, and despised how quickly the sentence arrived, as if I had been waiting for a room where I could risk saying it. "You will try," she agreed, "and you will fail some days. That isn't a prophecy. It's a schedule." I ate. Heat found my fingers again. My shoulders dropped the inch they had refused to drop for months. Asher finished the bottle, sighed the ridiculous sigh small things do when they discover enough, and let his head fall against the wool with the intimacy of a traveler learning a bed. "He'll shake for a while," Ivy said, eyes on the little chest. "Fear is a second heart. It doesn't stop when the first one learns it can." "I've been managing with one most of my life," I said. She didn't nod. She didn't offer the consolation people offer when they don't want to do the work of sitting through another person's history. She tightened the stove's draft instead, and let the extra air teach the fire a faster grammar. On a peg near the stove, a ragged oven mitt had been mended with sinew. You don't mend something unless you plan to stay. The room, I realized, was a thesis on the same subject. "Where did you learn to do all this?" I asked, without making it look like a miracle. "In places that couldn't afford miracle," she said. I set the empty bowl on the table and scanned the room again, greedy for evidence of a person who could make winter behave. Tools had been repaired in 3 distinct eras by 3 distinct moods: patient, hurried, and careful again. A rope had been spliced clean enough to trust. Hide straps, oiled and disciplined, hung in pairs. Over the table, a strip of cotton had been tacked to the rafters and written on with pencil dates, moon phases, a shorthand that turned sky into instruction. This wasn't a healer's shrine. It was a shop for someone who understood that healing is a practice you do every day whether anyone thanks you or not. Silence arrived, the thick, live kind that carries the hum of a fire and the small rearrangements of a sleeping animal. The other silence, the punitive kind that lives in clinics where names go unanswered and in penthouse glass where a man's reflection rehearses his guilt, didn't know the address. I felt my jaw loosen like a hinge finely oiled. My hands didn't know what to do when they weren't guarding anything. Why the laughter out there? I asked. Because rooms like this tempt you into telling the truth about the weather outside. Why cut a cinch? Why bait a line if the land will take what it wants back anyway? Because possession is louder than belonging, she said, and some men like loud. Do you know their names? She considered the question and declined to give it a place to sit. I know what they take. I know what they leave. She turned her eyes to Asher. And I know how to stand between. We let that live where it fell. Asher slept, his breath evening into something the room was willing to match. The fire learned our faces. I felt the old distance, the one I had worn as dignity, start to complain under the heat, like ice that has been told to become water whether it wants to or not. I stood to move for no reason other than I needed to put my hands on something that wasn't an apology. The window over the table looked east. The glass faintly rippled like water that had been asked to hold still for years. The sill was clean except for 3 things: a small stone polished by pocket time, a steel washer bent into a kind of ring, and a spent rifle casing, brass gone matte where fingers had handled it until it forgot its shine. The casing sat upright like a candle that had learned a different religion. It did not read as threat. It read as curriculum. I touched it with the back of a finger, cold, honest, the weight of something that had already decided to be over. You keep it there, why? I asked Ivy, without turning. So, I remember what loudness costs, she said, and her voice was soft enough that the statement became part of the room. And so I don't forget what we're up against when the day is kind and I am tempted to believe kindness is enough. I looked out through the glass at the line where the cottonwoods ended and the pasture began and knew that the laughter I had heard belonged to someone who preferred loud to true. The casing didn't threaten, it reminded. The distinction felt like a new kind of heat. I set the casing down exactly where it had stood and realized how precisely it marked the sill like a tiny upright witness that watched the door and the yard and the line of trees, and how, from this angle, it pointed to a single set of tracks I hadn't noticed before, a pair of boot prints that had approached Ivy's door in yesterday's light and stopped 1 pace short, as if their owner had learned just enough from this room to hesitate before he knocked. Secrets hold until footsteps learn the door. Sanctuary is quiet until it isn't. The first quiet was the kind you earn. We built it together by doing small things correctly. Ivy warmed milk in a pot that had known different winters and never failed one. I rinsed the bottle, the way she taught me, not with scalding water but with the same heat we were asking Asher to believe in. She showed me the rhythm: feed, rest, clean, warm, a liturgy without applause. When the room paused between tasks, she would say nothing, and her nothing had weight, presence, not absence, a kind of emotional intimacy I had spent years outrunning. Asher learned us. He learned the bottle first, because survival prefers the practical. He learned the smell of cedar second, because safety has a signature you can measure with breath. He learned my voice last, because my voice had not been a safe place for anyone in a long time, and trust does not change religions overnight. We slept in watches. She took first, I took second. The fire proved it could count to dawn. Outside, the wind committed minor crimes against the eaves, and then apologized by morning. I woke to the noises houses make when they like you, the small clicks of wood remembering its tree, the soft drag of hide on floor when you shift your weight. For the first time since the depot fell, I didn't feel like an intruder at breakfast. By noon the next day, Ivy had me mending a strap with a bone awl. The work was slow enough to cure thinking, she said, tight enough to hold, loose enough to forgive, and I believed her because the strap believed her first. Asher slept with one foot sticking straight out, the way the very young and the very safe allow themselves to look foolish. I stood over him with a hand open and realized it had been years since my palm was allowed to hover without becoming a fist. "You keep him?" I asked, not because I wanted the answer, but because I needed to hear the room say what it already knew. "We keep him until keeping becomes harm," she said. "Then we open a gate." "A gate," I repeated, skeptical in the way men get when the metaphor refuses to let them be tough. "Not a cage. Family isn't a cage," she said, as if she'd grown tired of tutoring the same misunderstanding. "It's a gate you stand beside. You don't shut it to keep someone yours. You hold it so they can choose." I looked down at Asher's notched ear and thought of all the gates I'd climbed in the wrong direction. Foster homes with porches that trained you to make your goodbyes tidy. Diner doors that tacked a bell to your comings in and goings out and never once rang differently for you. Clinic thresholds that waited for your name to stand up in a mouth not your own. The only gate I had learned to love was the one that swung behind me. I left. "What if he doesn't come back?" I asked, hearing the 13-year-old in me talk through a man's mouth. "Then you, built correctly," she said. "Gates that work don't trap." I wanted to argue, but Asher stirred, and the argument lost its heat. By late afternoon I knew where the house kept its truths. The wash basin with a thin crack at the lip that had been repaired with sap and thread, a mistake that had earned graduation rather than disposal. A map pinned above the table with a seam of brown tape down its middle, topography of a valley we were still learning to deserve. A shelf that held 3 books, their spines obscured by use, their titles unimportant compared to the hand that had turned their pages slowly. Sanctuary is a collage of repairs you stop apologizing for. The second quiet began with footsteps. They came clean at first, crisp on crusted snow, a civilized approach from the track through the yard. Ivy's head lifted without panic, the way a deer listens to weather. "Not hunters." She put the pot off-center on the stove so it wouldn't boil, then wiped her hands on her skirt with a patience that made my throat tight. I went to the window and the spent casing on the sill looked past me and did its job. It pointed like a compass needle at a man stepping out of a truck whose engine complained as if it resented being made to wait. He wore clean leather that hadn't earned its scuffs. His hat brim was too sharp for our valley. His coat had the false drape of expensive cloth doing an impression of work. He smiled as if the yard belonged to him and he was being playful about it. That smile didn't reach his eyes. It didn't need to. It had other work to do. Harlan Vexler didn't knock immediately. He took a long, slow look at the door, then the window, then the sled, then the stacked cedar as if he were pricing us, as if belonging were a ledger he could balance by finding the right column. When he raised his fist, it was to tap once, 2 knuckles, a rhythm that dared the room to admit it had a heart. Ivy didn't rush. She opened the door to the exact width required by sense. Cold leaned in and decided to behave. "Afternoon," Vexler said, his voice bright with the kind of politeness that stains. "Heard you've got something of mine." "Afternoon," Ivy said, tone so even it sanded his edge by a millimeter. "We have warmth and stew and work. The rest belongs to the land." Vexler's eyes slid past her to me and then to the crate where Asher blinked, small and undeniable. Recognition narrowed his gaze. He tipped his hat like he was blessing his own thought. "There he island, little notch." He lifted 2 fingers to his ear in a shape that mimicked Asher's injury, and then smiled as if nicknaming were ownership. Knew he'd be smart enough to walk into a door with fire behind it. Ivy didn't move. "What you know," she said, "can remain outside. Now, I'm a reasonable man," he continued, "the way unreasonable men do. He dipped into a pocket and came up with a folded paper and the air of someone for whom paper had never failed. Before we tangle ourselves in feelings and folkways, let's let the law be helpful. That cub is marked illegally. If you want to split hairs by contact with my equipment, duly registered lines, duly licensed bait. I felt Asher's breath thicken, not because he understood words, but because rooms teach lungs how to behave. I took half a step closer to the crate. Wexler noted it with a tiny uptick of chin, as if he had been expecting me to audition for the part of the man who cares too late. Bait isn't licensed, Ivy said, and marks made by harm don't become signatures. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for a speech. She simply refused the premise, and the refusal arrived in the room like a chair that didn't need carving. He offered the paper to her. She didn't take it. He set it on the sill instead, where the spent casing had already reserved a kind of courtroom. Deputy'll be along, he said lightly. He likes a tidy resolution. I'm here to make one easy. You hand me the animal. We avoid all the unpleasantness that comes from folks confusing sentiment with stewardship. Stewardship, I said, because the word shocked me with its audacity. The last time I heard it was in a room where men spoke about profits as if they were prayers. It didn't sound better in a doorway. Words behave differently in some mouths, Ivy murmured, not looking away from Wexler. He put both hands in his coat pockets and rocked once, as if we were children and he had time to wait out our tantrum. Look, he said, lowering his voice in a move that was supposed to read as confidential. I get it. A trembling thing chooses your boot, and you decide the universe gave you a job. But universe don't sign checks. I do. He let that sit a second, then found what he thought was the tender place. And you, he flicked his eyes toward me and smiled the kind of smile men use to invite other men to betray themselves. You don't strike me as someone who can afford to feed anything that doesn't pay you back. The old, urban, efficient, practiced in mirrors that cost more than the person reflected rose fast and hot. I knew 100 sentences that would put distance back where tenderness had started, and I was ready to use them all when Ivy put a wordless palm into the air, a gesture that interrupted me without humiliating. This is a rehabilitation, she said, enunciating each syllable as if signing a receipt. Cultural, biological, ethical. The tribe maintains protocols for injured wildlife. We abide by them. You may contact the ranger who knows our names. You can call anything a protocol, Wexler said, shrugging. And folks often do when they want to feel orderly about chaos. He reached to the sill, flicked the rim of the spent casing with a fingernail, made it ring a small, honest note. But brass is brass. Law is law. I'll be back with the deputy, and I'd hate for papers to complicate what neighborly hands could manage. He tipped his hat again, the gesture mocking its own politeness, and pivoted cleanly on the heel of boots that had never once needed to argue with mud. At the threshold he hesitated and looked back past Ivy, over the crate, to me. He found my eyes the way men do when they want you to, feel complicit in your own undoing. Sometimes, he said, the kindest thing is to let professionals handle delicate matters. Boys with bruised hearts do damage when they mean to heal. I have done damage when I meant to heal. That history barbed the sentence. I shut my mouth on the confession because some truths are not owed to the man who aims to sell them back to you at a markup. He stepped down into the yard, his coat making a small theater of movement. The truck received him with the devotion that only machines can feign. He had not touched Asher. He had not raised his voice. He had entered, named, priced, and left as if the room were an aisle in a store he owned by virtue of knowing how to speak to clerks. The engine coughed, laughed, and then held a low purr like a cat rehearsing patience. He didn't drive off immediately. He let the exhaust drift, and wrote something in it we would have to read later. Then, with a cheerful wave that tried to turn menace into community, he rolled down the track and vanished around the cottonwood, as if the land had leaned aside out of courtesy. Ivy shut the door gently and set the latch. The room exhaled. Asher whimpered, and I went to my knees so fast my joints complained. I curled a hand against his side and felt the little engine of him resume its ordinary work. "Deputy," I asked, hating how small the words sounded in my mouth. "Sometimes a uniform is a person," she said. "Sometimes it's a costume. We'll see which kind visits. And if paper shows up with him, paper doesn't feed anything," she said, "but it can starve what is already weak. We keep him strong." I went to the window and found my eyes pulled to the sill again. The folded paper Wexler had left sat next to the casing like a pamphlet laid on a headstone. I didn't open it. I watched the track instead, listening for the return of loudness. Nothing. Only the cottonwoods brushing the sky with bark and the creek beginning its evening argument with ice. "Why didn't he push harder?" I asked, feeling the question in my wrists. "Men like that don't enjoy waiting, because men like that have already chosen their next move," Ivy said, lifting the pot to pour a little heat into a cup for me and a little into a bottle for Asher. "They prefer you tired before they make it." I took the cup and looked at the door as if it could be read like weather. Asher took 3 greedy draws and then sighed again, greedy for nothing but breath. The room resumed its work, which is to say, it kept us alive without narrating it. Outside, the light thinned to the color of decision. Wexler had smiled the whole time, the way a man does when he's already written the ending, and the fact that he left so easily felt like the first line of a trap I would not see until it closed. Ivy said family without using the word. She fed us all without asking what we'd done to deserve it. The stew was humble, the kind that looked like nothing until it touched your ribs and reminded you that warmth wasn't just temperature, it was permission. Ivy ladled it into wooden bowls, handed one to me, one to the cub. She didn't ask where I'd come from, or why my hands shook when I took the bowl, or why my eyes lingered too long on the door as if expecting it to open the wrong way. She fed us all without asking what we'd done to deserve it. I wanted her to ask. I needed her to. Because mistrust is easier when people demand explanations. You can hand them a lie, keep them at arm's length, bury yourself in silence. But Ivy didn't ask. She simply placed warmth in front of me, wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulder, and sat as if my presence was already accounted for in the room's design. The cub lapped at his bowl, tongue clumsy, spilling broth onto his fur. Ivy wiped it with a piece of wool cloth, slow, gentle, not making a show of it. Asher, the name, had stuck so fast it felt inevitable, blinked up at her as if to ask if all nights could be like this. I chewed slowly, the broth running heat through my body in small waves, and finally said what I hadn't meant to say. "I don't know how to trust this." Her eyes lifted to me, steady. She didn't look offended or even surprised. "Trust isn't food," she said quietly. "It doesn't spoil if you don't use it fast. It waits. Sometimes it waits longer than people do." Her words cracked something in me, not loudly, more like a seam splitting after too much weight. I set the bowl down and rubbed my hands together hard, as if friction could erase the years they had spent folded in defense. "My father," I started, then stopped. The word father was heavier than the stew. It always had been. He believed silence was strength, that if you kept everything inside, you were less likely to lose it. I thought I understood him. But then one day he was gone, and all I had left was silence with no one to give it meaning. Ivy didn't fill the pause. She didn't press. She just leaned closer to the fire and stirred the coals, her face lit by flickering orange that made her look carved, not fragile. I stopped opening letters, I confessed, voice low, stopped answering names. In foster homes, it was safer not to want anything. Wanting meant losing. Even in the city, even when I had a roof, I'd sit in diners at 3 a.m., staring at cracked sidewalks outside, and think if I don't speak, no one can leave me. The fire popped. Asher stirred, let out a small sound that was more sigh than whimper, and curled against the wool. His breathing synced to the rhythm of the flames. I envied him, that easy trust. Ivy finally rose, walked to a peg, and lifted her shawl. It smelled of cedar smoke and long winters, the kind of fabric that has memorized storm. She crossed the room without a word and draped it across both me and Asher. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly warm, but it carried weight. Not fabric weight, oath weight. She had said family without using the word. My shoulders tensed at first, ready to reject it. Warmth has always been a trick in my story. Hunger is honest. It tells you what it wants. Cold is merciless. It doesn't pretend. But warmth demands you believe it won't vanish. And I had never believed that. But Asher leaned into it instantly, his head pressing against my chest, his tiny body surrendering to the shawl as if he'd been waiting his whole life for that particular fabric. And because he trusted, my body betrayed me. My muscles softened, my jaw unclenched. For the first time in years, my ribs expanded with a breath that didn't taste of desperation. Ivy sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the steadiness of her presence, but not so close that I could mistake it for possession. She didn't ask for my story. She didn't demand my trust. She simply offered her presence as if it were a structure I could lean against when my own walls crumbled. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full like a room newly built, waiting for furniture, waiting for laughter, waiting for years. And then Asher's ears twitched. He lifted his head, nose working the air. His body stiffened, not with fear of hunger or cold, but with recognition of something outside. I followed his gaze toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass. Beyond it, the dark. But the tracks were there, faint but certain. Not his, not mine, not Ivy's. Something else had circled the lodge in the dark, pressing its weight into the snow, testing the edges of our fire's reach. Ivy's shawl felt heavier then, not with warmth but with warning. Something out there knew we had chosen to stay. The storm tested the roof and named what we were building. If the roof holds, the promise can too. The storm didn't announce itself politely. It arrived like judgment. Snow hammered the floor, a lodge from every angle, the wind screaming in voices too raw to belong to weather alone. The roof groaned like a living thing, timbers flexing under the weight, beams arguing with every gust. If the roof holds, the promise can too, Ivy said simply, pulling her braid over her shoulder and cinching the shawl tighter. She spoke as though the storm was a test she had taken before, as though the lodge knew its duty and she was only here to remind it. I wasn't so sure. Every creak of the beams sounded like betrayal. Every moan of the wood sounded like a sentence preparing to end. I pressed my hand against the wall and felt the whole structure shudder under a gust that rattled my teeth. The cub whimpered. Asher's body pressed close against my chest, trembling in sync with the beams above us. I crouched low, whispering nonsense syllables, the kind of broken comfort that boys invent when they want to sound like fathers. But it wasn't working. His tiny breaths came too fast, chest heaving, heart racing like it wanted to escape his body. "Steady him," Ivy said, her voice somehow audible through the roar. She crouched beside me, pressed her hand to my shoulder. "Don't speak. Don't fight. Breathe." "I am breathing," I snapped, panic sharp in my throat. "Not with him," she said firmly. "Sink." I looked down. Asher's eyes were wide, desperate. His breaths were shallow, erratic. Mine weren't much better. I closed my eyes and forced myself to slow. In, out, not at my rhythm, at his. I matched his panic first, then pulled it down, one beat at a time. It was like guiding a runaway horse. Don't yank, don't fight. Just lean the rope until it remembers the way. Slowly, impossibly, his chest began to match mine. The frantic gasps softened into a rhythm we shared. His trembling ease, his head lowered against me, eyes fluttering shut. I exhaled. Not relief, but recognition. This is what trust feels like when it's earned. Watched, her eyes steady. She didn't praise me. She didn't soften the moment. She only nodded once, as if to say, "This is the work. Now do it again tomorrow." The storm clawed harder, trying to steal the victory. The roof boomed under a drift collapsing onto it. I rose, bracing one shoulder against the beam. Ivy pressed beside me, her hand gripping the timber with the calm of someone who understood that buildings survive the way people do, by leaning together. For an hour, maybe more, we braced the roof, our shoulders side by side, Asher curled against my chest, the storm screaming above us. I'd never shared silence like this, not the punishing kind, but the steady kind. The silence of survival earned as a group, the silence that doesn't erase you, but includes you. By the time the storm began to wane, my body shook with exhaustion. My arms ached, my breath came in harsh gasps. Ivy lowered her hands, let the beam go, and exhaled like someone who'd passed another test she already knew the answers to. I slumped against the wall, sliding down until I sat on the floor, Asher still warm against me. The cub sighed, finally calm, as if the storm had been nothing but background noise. I envied him again. For a moment, I thought we had passed the trial, that the danger was outside, in the snow, in the storm, that survival was enough for now. But then the light cut through, not dawn, not firelight, a glare, white, harsh, mechanical. It pushed through the storm in twin beams that swept across the lodge like searchlights. Ivy froze, her hand going to the window. She pulled the curtain back just enough for me to see. Headlights, crawling through the blizzard, a vehicle climbing toward us, tires chewing snow like it had every right to be here. Not the storm, she whispered, them. And in that glare, I realized storms aren't always made of weather. Some, come on, predators, prefer paperwork. When teeth won't do, they brought contracts. We brought breath. The lights found our window like hands. They swept the walls, threw our shadows large, flattened the fire into a nervous coin. Ivy didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for the latch and laid 2 fingers on it as if calming a horse. The storm hissed around the eave. Asher stirred against my chest, felt the light, and tucked himself deeper into the dark we'd made for him. They brought contracts, I said, because fear likes to be named, and someone to hold the pen. They brought loudness, Ivy answered. We bring breath. The knock wasn't a request. 2 knuckles, measured, the same rhythm Harlan Vexler used when he wanted a door to remember who paid the taxes on hinges. Ivy opened to the width of sense, cold-nosed in. Vexler filled the gap with his hat low, his grin rehearsed. Beside him stood a deputy in a county jacket that fit like a costume face windburn, eyes too alert to be entirely comfortable. Afternoon again, Vexler said, cheerful as a hooked fish. Brought a friend to tidy what Mercy left untidy. The deputy lifted a palm, not quite a wave. Deputy Rains, he said. His gaze slid past us, landed on the crate, and paused. He took in Asher's notched ear, the tremor, the bottle on the table, the cedar smoke working its slow medicine. His jaw tightened, then remembered the academy and relaxed. Vexler unfolded paper with the gravity of a pastor. Legality's a blanket on cold days, he said. Marked wildlife intersecting with licensed lines is property until otherwise adjudicated. That one's marked. My ear, my trap, my claim, Asher whimpered. I felt my grip fail a millimeter. Paper can do what teeth cannot. It can make a man believe that tenderness is theft. Ivy didn't touch the document. He's not a ledger entry, she said. He's a life. The tribe maintains wildlife protocols recognized by the protocol. District Ranger. This is a rehabilitation until he can live without us, or without you. Vexler's smile proved how little he needed faces to agree with his mouth. Protocols, he repeated, like a man trying on a hat he planned to sell. Those can take days, weeks. Meanwhile, liability accumulates disease, damage, displacement. He angled his head toward Rains. Deputy, help me help them, help the law. Rains shifted his boots an inch. The inch mattered. I'm here to keep peace, he said, staring at the floor just long enough to read the scuff marks, and to keep paper honest. Vexler sailed on. Look, Boone Silas Boone, right? The sound of my name in his mouth felt like he'd stolen it. I get charity. I love charity in churches and on postcards, but out here, charity starves, stewardship feeds. You can't feed what you can't afford to keep. There it was, the angle. The exact shape of shame I'd spent years smoothing in mirrors. I looked down at Asher's face, the ash smudge between his eyes, the small breath fogging my coat. I heard a younger me in a diner at 3 in the morning, telling myself that leaving is cheaper than belonging. Vexler had brought contracts. My past nodded along. Silas, Ivy said softly, and I realized she'd stepped half in front of me, not shielding, bracing. Hold the gate. Her words landed in the room like a beam under strain. Family isn't a cage, it's a gate you stand beside. We'd said it yesterday, and I had believed it in theory. Now paper wanted to prove the theory thin. I looked at Deputy Rain. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the sill, at the spent casing we kept there like curriculum, at the folded claims set beside it. The brass caught a lick of firelight. The paper didn't. He took a slow breath that only someone watching his chest would notice. "What's the rush, Harlan?" he asked, his voice neutral as snow. "Storm's still chewing the road. Ranger's office opens at 8. We can get a call through even if lines are touchy. Because delay is theft," Wexler said smoothly. "Compassion is lovely. So is compliance." I felt it then, the exact second I might cave. The old reflex rose, the one that says surrender what you love before someone tears it away. My hands lightened. The latch sang under Ivy's fingers like a string tuned to warning. I bent to set Asher in the crate. He made a small sound at the moment my grip loosened. Not fear, a question. It reached back through every door I'd shut gently on my own face. "Are you staying?" I did something I'd never done in the presence of men like Harlan Wexler. I chose a harder yes. I pulled him back to my chest, lifted my chin, and found the deputy's eyes. "This isn't charity," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. "It's stewardship, the kind that refuses possession. We'll wait for the ranger. We'll let protocols work. We're not handing him to paper." Rain's eyes flicked once there, then gone. A tell or a promise. I couldn't tell which. He turned to Wexler. "You want this clean," he said. "You do it clean. We log, we call, we return when daylight helps us count." Wexler's mouth didn't lose the smile, but it forgot how to enjoy it. He folded the paper with exaggerated care, slid it back into his coat, then leaned his shoulder against the frame like he planned to wear the doorway as a trophy. "Delay then," he said, pleasant as poison. "I'm a patient man. Patience pays." He stepped closer than comfort. Cedar tried to stand between us and failed on principle. Scent can't be a shield when a man wants your breath. He lowered his voice so that only my ribs could hear it. "If I can't take the cub, Boone," he whispered, the word take polished with long use, "I'll take your past." The storm's tantrum calmed by midnight, but inside the lodge a different weather came, a heat that didn't belong to cedar or flame. Asher dozed restless, twitching in dreams no animal should have to dream. When I lifted him to check the bottle, his skin flinched against my palm. Heat climbed my wrist like a warning. "Ivy," I said, and the word broke in the middle. She was already moving, one hand to her drawer, one hand to Asher's ear, a quick press to the inner thigh where blood tells the truth first. "Fever," she said, not surprised. It was waiting under fear. Fear had been my first heartbeat for years. I understood exactly what she meant. We laid him on the wool. The room stilled the way rooms do when they agree to hold their breath. Ivy's voice turned into a map. "Hydration first. Slow. He'll fight it." She handed me the bottle and a shallow spoon. 2 swallows. Pause. 2 more. "Breathe with him." I knelt. Asher's eyes were glass bright, unfocused, searching a room that no longer matched the one we stood in. I touched my forehead to his for a second, our heat, our weather, then slid the spoon to his lip. He took the first swallow like a chore, the second like a mercy. I paused because she said pause, and because rushing is another kind of harm. Ivy wrung a cloth in cool water, laid it across the ash mark above his eyes. She moved with the calm that comes from losing before and refusing to let loss write every ending. "Not too cold," she said. "Shock is theater. We aren't performing." The fever made the lodge small. The fire hissed its approval of water. The kettle stuttered into steam and then decided to be helpful. The herbs hanging from the beam turned their scent down to let us concentrate. I listened for the storm and heard only wind checking the latch like a neighbor who means well. "Talk to him," Ivy said. "What do I say?" I asked. Ridiculous. A grown man asking permission to speak. "Say what you wish someone had said to you," she answered, without looking up. I set the spoon down and set the past beside it. "I'm here," I told Asher. I don't leave before morning. I don't leave at all unless leaving is how you live. You're not a burden. You're a body I'm learning to carry without turning you into proof of anything. The words didn't sound like speeches. They sounded like the quiet I'd wanted once under a blanket that smelled like detergent and somebody else's dog. He shivered, then sighed, then fought again. The fever climbed, furious at our patience. Ivy cooled the cloth, turned him gently to ease his breath, lifted his paw, and pressed along the pads to read circulation like Braille. She hummed once, not a lullaby, something older, the kind of sound that builds scaffolds under structures you can't see. I always arrive late, I said suddenly. The confession surprised me with its appetite. I arrive after the door closes, after the name's called, after the letter yellowed, after the flame gutters. Then stay early now, she said. She didn't meet my eyes. She met my breath and pulled it into a steadier rhythm by the force of her own. Stay before he needs you. Stay even when it bores you. We worked in 10-minute eternities. 2 swallows, pause, cloth, breathe, check, repeat. My knees went numb against the floorboards. The crackle in the stove became metronome, then prayer. Once Asher made a small sound like apology. Once he tried to stand and failed. Once I wanted to pick him up and run outside to trade places with the cold, to bargain heat for frost if frost would let him sleep. Ivy's palm touched my shoulder when that impulse rose. The touch said, "Don't move the altar. Learn the ritual." Sometime after 2, he cried a thin animal thread that hooked into every tendon I owned. I panicked and the room flinched with me. The spoon clinked the bowl and I cursed it, as if metal could act with malice. "Silas," Ivy said, the word a rope. "Sink." The same instruction as in the storm, but softer, aimed under my ribs. I matched his ragged breaths, then led them toward shore. He followed because bodies prefer company to chaos. The fever paused at the top of a cruel hill and considered doubt. "Will he?" I started, breaking my rule against future questions. "He'll be what he is," she said. "If we give him a path back." We gave him one, inch by inch. I told him things I'd never told anyone. How the first woman who tried to love me moved to the city of her dreams and left a plant on my windowsill so I'd have something alive to fail. How I let it die slower than I should have, practicing grief, as if rehearsal would blunt the premiere. How I once stood outside a clinic with a letter of truth in my pocket and chose to read the street signs instead. I didn't know whether words matter to fever. Maybe they matter to the adult speaking them more. Toward the long end of night, the heat flickered, not surrender fatigue. Ivy took the cloth away, waited a minute, replaced it, read the pulse again. Her face didn't change. She swayed once, like a tired tree. I wanted to make her sit. She wouldn't. Some altars require 2 sets of hands and the memory of a third. Dawn announced itself not with light but with fewer shadows. The window thawed at the edges. In the hush that follows wreckage, Asher's breath even, not perfect, human enough. He slept like sleep had decided to remember him. I wiped my face on my sleeve, saw it was wet, decided not to be embarrassed by that particular weather. Ivy sat back on her heels and let her hands hang. "Early," she said, allowing herself half a smile. "You stayed early." Before I could answer, before gratitude could choose its words, the door announced a new kind of morning. 3-knuckle, neither timid nor entitled, a pause long enough to be polite, then a voice at the edge of the frame, warm with regret. "Anyone awake in there?" Ivy's eyes cut to mine. The name arrived on her breath and mine at the same time. Gideon Harlow knocked on the door, hat in hand. Gideon Harlow told me how his saddle fell. Guilt rode up my road wearing another man's coat. He stood on the threshold like a man applying to enter his own life. Hat in hand, snow stinging his graying beard, eyes taking stock not just of the room but of the temperature of our forgiveness. The last time I'd seen his name, it belonged to a saddle asleep in frost and the story of a fall the land wouldn't finish, telling me, "Come in," Ivy said, "making room the way you do for weather you've learned to respect. Leave the cold where it can find its way home." Gideon stepped in and the lodge read him, decided not to flinch. He closed the door carefully, as if doors could bruise. His coat smelled of horse and regret. He saw Asher first the notched ear, The ash smudge, the rise and fall that meant our night had been worth what it cost, and something unclenched behind his eyes. So he lived, he said. His voice carried the rasp men earn by shouting at wind and not at people. Thank God and the both of you. He held his hat with 2 hands, turning it a 1/4 inch as if measuring time. That was my saddle, he said to me, as if I'd accused him of leaving it, or what's left of it. Horse spooked on ice. Not smart, not malicious, just young. Strap gave. I cut the cinch to free him before he dragged it into hell. Then I heard a truck on the ridge, and another sound I know too well. Trap, Ivy said, not asking. Gideon nodded once. Bait line, furs from last week. Wrong meat where it doesn't belong. I've argued with Vexler for 2 winters and he answers with paper. I went looking for the rig, found blood, not mine, not horse, and then I saw him. He tipped his chin toward Asher. Too small to be alone, too brave to run. You left flannel by the creek, I said, memory locating the stiff red scrap. Marker, he said. I figured if decent eyes found it, they'd follow. If Vexler did, he'd check the wrong bank first. He took a step closer, stopped as if bumping a fence he believed in. I should have stayed, he said, and the words were a basin he'd carried here to empty. But the truck came closer. I led them north, made noise, bought time. Then the ice had its say with me. A shoulder went. I walked home crooked and sat until the dark moved. Guilt rode quietly on his back, the way expensive coats do when men forget to forgive themselves. He wasn't the first to put a saddle on regret and call it responsibility. We don't need apology, Ivy said. We need testimony. Gideon nodded, relief and duty sharing the same chair. He reached inside his coat and brought out a rolled map soft with use. He laid it on the table, held the corners with his hat, a mug, a jar of salve, a carpenter's pencil sharpened by knife. The county unfolded under our hands. Ridges like ribs, creek a spine, pasture a pale lung. Here, he said, tapping the bench above the cottonwoods. Fresh bait this week. Hides strung too high for coyotes, too low for eagles. Here, another tap. Snare run on a game trail that hasn't been used by anything but men in a month. He's dressing a corridor to catch what follows scent, not hunger. He marked a 3rd spot, then a 4th, his finger trembling only when it hovered near the bank where we'd found the tidy fire and the coil of cord. And this, he said softly, where I cut the cinch, where the saddle fell, where I heard him cry. He couldn't say cub. Some words feel like admissions when you're used to living by categories that don't survive in rooms like this. He handed me the pencil. You draw like a man who understands gates, he said, surprising me with a compliment I didn't deserve. Show where you'll stand if he brings paper again. My hand moved before my doubt could complain. I circled the lodge and drew arrows that favored the slope, the fence posts, the drifts that could be made into walls if a knight asked. Ivy watched with approval and correction. She turned one arrow a degree south. Wind will help there, she said. And hurt there. Gideon folded the map once, then unfolded it again, the way men do when they are trying to buy time from a clock that hasn't been generous lately. He'll call the deputy, Gideon said. He'll wear law like a good coat. He'll ask you to be tidy. You can't. You have to be true. Deputy Rains is complicated, I said carefully. He's a man, Ivy said, which is to say, available to both better and worse. We invite the better. We drank coffee that had learned patience. Asher stirred, dipped toward waking, then reconsidered. Gideon looked at him a long minute, and then looked at my hand. I didn't realize until then that I was still cupping the air near the crate, palms open in case he fell. You care, Gideon said, not a question, a surprise that warmed him from the inside out. Haven't seen that in a mouth like Vexler's in years. Care is cheaper than paper, I said before I could help myself. He smiled, a small thing that made his face younger. It's also more expensive, he said, but it pays what it owes. Outside, the storm remembered us and shook the roof once to see if we were still listening. We were. Ivy straightened the spent casing on the sill. Rains's hesitation from yesterday hung in the room like a coat someone had forgotten to claim. The map lay open like a confession we intended to use as a plan. Gideon set his hat on his head and drew his coat close. "I'll put my name on anything that needs it," he said. "Affidavit, statement, hell, I'll carve it into a post if the ranger prefers wood to ink. Trap lines like his turn neighbors mean. I'm tired of mean." He stepped toward the door and paused to look at Asher again, the way a man looks at a child he doesn't know how to bless without lying. "Live, little Ash," he murmured. "Live and make us behave." He opened the door to gauge the morning. The wind had calmed to busy work. Snow lifted off the yard in small ghosts. The line of cottonwoods wrote its scripture against a sky that had finally remembered blue. For a second I tasted relief, the thin kind that arrives before the bill. Then the air cut itself. A metallic snap cracked the yard, sharp as a bone remembering. The way it broke, not the wind, not the house. A trap doing the job it was designed to do, in a place it had no right to live. Ivy's head turned toward the sound. Gideon went still in the doorway, hat suddenly too small for the news. My hands clenched the edge of the table as if wood could translate what blood was about to tell us. Outside, just beyond the last post of the fence, Vexler's last gift answered the morning with iron, four-wheel, with names written in ink. We opened a gate and waited without owning the outcome. The latch clicked louder than a gunshot. That's what it felt like, the gate's hinge cracking the morning air, announcing to the world that choice had arrived. The snow under my boots was thin-crusted, breaking with each shift of weight, and the sound joined the hinge in a duet that made the woods lean closer. The cub Asher, though the name had become more than name, stood just behind the line of posts we had raised, trembling but steady, staring at the open path the way a soldier stares at a door that could mean life or ambush. The air smelled of thawing cedar and wet earth, but inside my chest it smelled like loss. Family isn't a cage, Ivy had told me hours earlier, her voice calm as she tied the last knot on the post. It's an open gate you stand beside, but I had never trusted open gates. Open gates meant people leaving. Open gates meant waiting for footsteps that never returned. Now I was the one holding it open. Asher blinked at me, his black eyes wet with something I didn't have words for. He pawed at the frost once, twice, then pressed his nose against my palm. His warmth shocked me, animal heat that carried memory, need, trust. And here was the war inside me. Everything in me screamed to clutch him tighter, to close the gate and promise safety. Because safety meant control. Because safety meant I didn't have to risk another absence. But Ivy's words struck again, steady as heartbeat. Family isn't a cage. It's a gate you guard, not lock. My breath shook, the cold fogging the air between us. Slowly, painfully, I opened my hand. Asher lingered a second longer, pressing his paw into my palm, deliberate, weighty, like a seal on a vow. Then he turned, walked forward, one step, two, then more, until the trees bent and took him in. The sound of him vanished faster than sight. Only his tracks remained, dark smudges in the pale crust, already softening under the breath of wind. And in the silence after, my body felt lighter and heavier all at once, lighter for letting go, heavier for what that letting go meant. Ivy's hand found mine, not to replace what I'd lost, not to command, to steady. Her shawl brushed my arm, cedar and smoke blending with the bite of morning. She leaned close. Her whisper was softer than snow but struck like iron. Stay forever. And this time, for the first time, I knew she wasn't speaking to the cub. She was speaking to me. I turned toward her, ready to answer yes, maybe, anything, when the horizon growled, low, mechanical, wrong, the sound of an engine clawing through thaw, tires chewing ruts into frozen ground, the rhythm of intrusion. Vexler, the cub, had vanished into trees, but the man who claimed him hadn't vanished at all. The cub was gone, but the roar crawling over the ridge promised he wasn't finished with us yet. The sky was bruised blue when Vexler's engine finally cut off in the distance. The smell of exhaust lingered in the snow like a warning, but inside the lodge the fire still breathed steady, and Asher's claw marks had already written a counter-story into the cottonwoods. The world had shifted overnight. Not because Vexler was gone, men like him never really vanish, but because we hadn't given him what he came for. For once, the law bent toward life instead of ledger. Deputy Rains had stood taller than his badge. Gideon had carried his guilt into testimony, and Ivy, she had held the silence, steady long enough for me to finally hear it as presence instead of punishment. But even in victory, my chest refused peace, because absence is loud when you've lived a life of waiting at open gates. That morning, proof came quietly. No fanfare, no parade, just scratches on bark, deliberate and high. The cottonwood near the ridge wore 3 claw marks that hadn't been there yesterday. Beneath them, a tuft of fur clung stubbornly to rough grain, coarse and dark, carrying the wild in its scent. I pressed my hand against the grooves. The wood was cold, but the scars were warm in memory. They weren't deep, but they were certain. That's how belonging works. It doesn't shout, it doesn't beg. It carves itself slow, deliberate, permanent. He's riding himself now, Ivy said beside me, her shawl brushing against my arm. Cedar and smoke drifting into the thaw, and the land knows how to keep his story. Her voice sank deeper than the marks. I stared at the tree and wondered if Asher remembered my palm, if somewhere in his wild run he carried the heat of that last touch, if survival had rewritten him without erasing us. The wind picked up, tugging at her braids. At the loose flap of my coat, the woods whispered, not words, just presence, a sound that said, I'm here, I was here, I will be here again. We walked back to the lodge without speaking. Some truths don't need rehearsals. Some silences are already whole. Inside, the fire snapped awake, scattering sparks like stars too impatient to wait for night. The saddle Gideon had left broken weeks ago leaned against the wall, cracked leather and gilt stitched into every seam. I carried it to the table, laid it flat, and pulled the tin of oil Ivy kept by the hearth. The smell was sharp linseed, leather, smoke. My hands trembled as I worked, rubbing balm into scars, coaxing the hide to remember softness. Each stroke was an apology to the man who dropped it, a confession to the boy who carried it, a vow to the cub who had trembled beside it. Slowly, the color deepened, cracks blurred. The saddle stopped looking like a ruin and started looking like something waiting to be used again. When I lifted it, it was heavier than I remembered, but it was the kind of weight I wanted. Not burden, belonging. I climbed the beam ladder and hung it where it belonged, not as curse, not as shrine, but as reminder. A fallen saddle can rise again if someone cares enough to lift it. Ivy stood behind me, shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes steady in the firelight. She didn't need to ask what it meant. She saw. She always saw. The room breathed with us, smoke curling slow, fire humming low, cedar sharp in the rafter. Silence filled the spaces words couldn't, and then her whisper came again, soft as thaw, heavy as law. The same words that had haunted every open gate since the day I carried Asher from the fire. Stay forever. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a plea. It was an invitation. A door she had built with patience and left ajar long enough for me to trust it wouldn't slam. For the first time, I didn't resist. My ribs unclenched, my breath steadied, and the silence between us grew warm instead of cold. The horizon kept its appointment. So did we. The cub left claw marks. I left silence behind. Gideon left his guilt on a map the ranger signed. Even Rains left with more truth than he arrived with. But Ivy, she left me with only one vow that mattered. I heard her whisper again, stay forever, and this time I believed it. And for the first time, forever.